Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is a fantastic organisation that works very hard to support animal studies scholars. ASA does a lot of things for animal studies scholars, including organising a conference every 2 years. The next conference is coming up in mid-2019 and it will be held in New Zealand. So please have a think about joining ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association, and support the organisation that supports animal studies scholars. Well, this is another very exciting episode of Knowing Animals. I'm coming to you from Mexico City, where I'm attending the Minding Animals Conference. And I'm very fortunate to be joined by another one of those fantastic international guests that I would normally not have an opportunity to interview. Today I'm joined by Jeff Sebo. Jeff is a director, actually, of Minding Animals, and he's also at the Animal Studies MA program at New York University. And today we're going to discuss his book chapter, Animals and Climate Change, which will soon be available. The book is called Philosophy in Climate Change, and it will be edited by, I should have checked with all these names. Jeff, do you want to jump in and tell me the names of the editors? It's Mark
Budolfson,
Tristram
McPherson,
David Plunkett, and it's published by Oxford University Press.
Yeah.
Welcome to the podcast, Jeff.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Jeff, what led you to write this chapter?
What led me to write this chapter? Well, I think what led me to write this chapter is that I have a background in animal studies and environmental studies and have done a lot of work on ethical and political obligations to non-human animals in the context of environmental issues. And then beyond that, I had an opportunity to write this chapter. The editors are editing this book on philosophy and climate change, and they wanted somebody to represent animals, and I was grateful that they wanted somebody to represent animals. And I thought it would be a good opportunity to think about the many ethical and political issues that come up surrounding animals and climate change. And of course, there turns out to be a million issues that come up around that topic.
So let's start by thinking about us, or let me start by asking you, why do you think that animals tend to be excluded from the climate change debate?
Well, I think there are probably a lot of reasons for that. One reason that animals are excluded from the climate change debate is that animals are excluded from every debate, so it follows from a more general principle. But another reason is I think that climate change, even if you focus only on humans, is overwhelming, is already a perfect moral storm. We already have to be thinking about collective action problems and global ethics and intergenerational ethics and trying to motivate individuals and communities and states to act against their perceived short-term self-interest for the sake of other people and other nations and future generations. And that already feels so hard to do that if you then remind them that they have to address food in order to do that, and if they also have to attend to the impacts on wild animal populations as part of doing that, I think people would experience that as one step too far. But the upshot is that we've systematically neglected the role of animal agriculture as a cause of climate change and wild animals as victims of climate change.
Yes, so I feel like I'm skipping ahead a little bit to the way I was imagining we'd discuss it, but as you've suggested this topic already, let me skip forward and then we'll come back to more of the detail of the chapter.
Okay, sure, yeah.
But how are people responding to the suggestion that we've got to think about animals in a situation, in a climate change future where a lot of humans are going to suffer? Have you had responses to that?
Well, I probably have a not very representative sample because a lot of people in my community are animal studies or environmental studies people who might be a little bit more open to this idea. So a lot of people in my world are open to this idea and are already on board with this idea, though many people in animal studies and environmental studies are still thinking about the impacts of climate change on wild animals primarily in terms of species and ecosystems and not as much in terms of individual wild animals. And so I think there is still some work to do in terms of persuading people in our world to think about this issue a little bit more in terms of individual wild animals. Of course, in the broader world, I imagine that a lot of people might be interested in it, might be open to it, because they do care about species loss, they do care about biodiversity loss, and they do care about stories they hear about individual wild animals. But I think that they would think that this is an interesting and important topic that no one is ever going to do anything about, and we should probably be focusing on, more direct and short-term risks that people are facing.
So, Jeff, as you noted earlier, there's probably an infinite amount of ways in which we could think about animals and climate change. And you've made some strategic decisions. You think about it in terms of animal agriculture as an input and then wildlife at the other end as the impact. So let's start with the input.
Sure. Why
animal agriculture? How does that fit into the picture of climate change?
So animal agriculture is a major driver of human-caused climate change. There are different studies and different estimates, but one very influential estimate says that industrial animal agriculture more generally, is responsible for an estimated 9% of global carbon emissions, 37% of global methane emissions, and 65% of global nitrous oxide emissions, which is especially alarming if you take into account the fact that methane traps heat 23 times as effectively as carbon, and nitrous oxide traps heat 296 times as effectively as carbon. So if you put that all together, industrial animal agriculture and animal agriculture more generally is responsible for an estimated 14.5 to 51% of global greenhouse gas emissions, depending on how you frame the stats and which particular report you trust, which even if you go on a conservative estimate, 14.5% or even 10%, is a massive contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. And so my view is that we need to center resistance to and abolition of industrial animal agriculture as part of our climate mitigation efforts.
Jeff, I was at a conference, this was quite a few years ago now. It was Pork Growers of Australia, I think. They asked me to speak about why people are concerned about pork growing. And there was another gentleman there who was putting a lot of effort into working out how pork could have a better environmental impact, and he was comparing a pork burger to a lentil burger. And do you worry that taking this approach, when I think you're also probably quite concerned about the welfare or the rights of animals, could perhaps backfire in the sense that animal agriculture could become more, say, greenhouse friendly?
Yes, I do worry about that. I think it would be a major mistake to focus exclusively on the environmental impacts of animal agriculture in advocacy against animal agriculture, in the same way that I think it would be a major mistake to focus exclusively on the health impacts of animal agriculture, or for that matter, even focus exclusively on the animal welfare impacts. I think that the best way to resist animal agriculture is to focus on the full spectrum of things that it does very badly. It has terrible impacts for non-human animals, for public health, for the environment, for workers, for everybody. And I think that if we talk about this issue holistically and take very seriously all of the different impacts and the ways in which they interconnect, we can build a much broader coalition of people who are standing in opposition to animal agriculture. But with that said, I think that the person you were talking to is wrong, and that I have a very hard time imagining a way of producing pork burgers that would in fact be more environmentally sustainable than lentil burgers, unless you really seriously and cynically distort the data.
Yes, well, I wish you'd been with me that day. But I think one of the things that he was relying on was that you might dress the burger with lettuce and other very water-intense crops. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, if lettuce is speeding up climate change, I can live without lettuce. Let's take away the lettuce. So, Jeff, now let's think about the other end of the spectrum. So we're thinking about the impact. So you choose to think about it in terms of wildlife. Can you tell listeners how you see it impacting wildlife?
So I think that this is a really difficult topic, which is part of what makes me excited about it, excited to be working on it, and for other people to be working on it too. As I said before, I do think that many people are thinking about this issue primarily in terms of species extinction, biodiversity loss, and ecosystem collapse. And of course, I think that those things are important in part because you might think that those things are intrinsically important, and in part because even if all you care about is individual wild animals, obviously species, ecosystems, and so on are relevant to the well-being of individual wild animals. But with that said, if what you really care about is individual wild animals, then you have to ask a lot of questions and wrap your head around a lot of issues before you can really determine what the impacts of climate change on individual wild animals will be and what, if anything, we can do to effectively and efficiently address that issue. So, for example, we have to figure out which kinds of species are going to do well and which kinds of species are going to do badly under climate change. It may be that many species go extinct, but it may also be that many other species expand to take their place. And so we have to figure out what the average or total effects on individual wild animal well-being might be if certain trends occur under climate change. Then we also have to figure out which of these many species of animals have subjective well-being, experience pleasure and pain, have desires and preferences and interests so that they can genuinely be benefited or harmed by climate change or by our own interventions. So, for example, if the estimated 10 quintillion insects in the world are conscious, then that would add up to a massive amount of happiness or suffering that would really have to be centered in our discussion. So we have to wrap our heads around those issues too. And then we also have to figure out what, if anything, we can do to effectively and efficiently intervene in climate-related wild animal suffering. I think many of us do want to do right by wild animals, especially if humans are complicit in the problems that wild animals are dealing with. But our track record when it comes to intervening in millennia-old, extremely intricate ecosystems is not good. And so I think that we need to have an enormous amount of epistemic humility when it comes to our ability to fix the problems that we've caused. So I both think that we should not shrink away from those problems, but that we should be enormously cautious and humble when it comes to figuring out what, if anything, we can do to solve them. So we have to figure out all of those issues and many more issues before we can even begin to think seriously about what we owe to wild animals in virtue of climate-related wild animal suffering. And so my attitude is that A, we should be researching interventions in wild animal suffering now, and B, we should be advocating for moral and political rights for all animals, including wild animals now, so that we have both the knowledge and the political will to help them if and when the time comes.
Wow, Jeff, that all sounds exhausting. So for listeners, what should the, say, Joe Blogs on the street, Joe Citizen be doing to help with the kinds of issues you're talking about?
Well, I think there are many things that people can do to help. Not everybody needs to write scholarship or do teaching on wild animals, for example. But I think in general, participating in the animal rights movement, or even if your focus is other social movements, incorporating a concern for the oppression of animals, including wild animals, into the kind of work that you do, in the same kind of way that animal activists should be incorporating concerns for anti-racism and anti-sexism and anti-ableism into the work that we do, that would be enormously useful for persuading everybody, no matter what they care about, to think about these issues in a holistic and interconnected way. So I think that we should all be incorporating concern for all oppressed groups, including animals, into all of the advocacy and all of the work that we do. If people do that, and of course going vegan, if you are able economically and otherwise to do so, all of that helps. And then in general, just being open to having your views and assumptions about these issues challenged, because a lot of the places I think we need to go are genuinely surprising and implausible when you first hear about them. For example, some of the things that I've been saying today.
Jeff, I ask everybody who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Sure, yes.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes, I can. As probably 95% of the people on your program have said, All Animals Are Equal by Peter Singer.
Animal liberation is very popular, but All Animals Are Equal isn't as popular. But is that a section is that a chapter from the book? Or
it is chapter 1 of Animal Liberation.
Oh, chapter 1, and then it was reproduced in some other publications,
I think it might have been an independent paper that then became chapter 1, but I'm not totally sure about that.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
I can. I was a college sophomore or junior, and I wrote a paper for an ethics class called something like Critique of the Kantian Theory of Indirect Duties to Non-Human Animals. And that was actually a really formative paper for me, because I then had an opportunity to go present it at an animal liberation conference at Syracuse in 2004. And there were a bunch of amazing animal studies people there. Karen Davis was there, Patrice Jones was there. And so I was meeting all of these amazing people who were doing incredible work in the field. And I was this college sophomore, junior, trying to get experience giving a philosophy talk. And being around them was really formative. So I was glad that I got to write and eventually publish that paper. I never talk about it anymore because Christine Korsgaard later published a much better critique of traditional interpretations of Kant and animals, but it was a nice experience for me to have.
Wonderful. So, Jeff, if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Well, I already mentioned Singer, and I should also mention Reagan and everybody else who people talk about, and I should give a shout out to my college professors, Richard Galvin and Carol Thompson, who taught me that and supported me in doing animal advocacy when I was in college. But if I can briefly mention two people, because I have to mention both of these people, Dale Jameson and Lori Gruen have both been enormously influential for me intellectually and personally. Both of them have really shaped how I think about these issues and been incredible friends and mentors who have really helped me to figure out how to do this kind of work in a way that I can feel good about.
Well, wonderful mentors. So, Jeff, what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I think the most important thing at this stage, is related to my answer to your question about what people on the street can do, which is care about the issue and incorporate the issue into everything you do. When you write things, when you teach things, incorporate concern for animal oppression into your writing, into your syllabi. And if you happen to be working in animal studies, help us to build animal studies as an interdisciplinary field that rigorously and systematically explores these issues in a way that resonates with other people, including other academics, and in a way that resonates with people, including activists and advocates and philanthropists who are working on the ground to help animals. Striking that balance, being a serious scholarly field that people really respect, and being engaged with and of use to advocates is a hard thing to do, but I think the only way to develop this field that will actually be impactful.
Wonderful. So, Jeff, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Well, I feel like this is a cop-out, but I would maximize happiness and minimize suffering for all sentient beings, human and non-human, from now until the end of time.
Jeff, I was going to ask you what philosophical framework you tend to work within, but I think I might have figured it out already without having to ask you explicitly.
Yeah, I am absolutely a utilitarian through and through, though I should say I'm a utilitarian who is very receptive to many of the practical and epistemic critiques that people make of utilitarianism. So for example, I do think that we should maximize happiness and minimize suffering. I do think we should use evidence and reason to do the most good we can, but I also think we should be very concerned about measurability bias, status quo bias, standpoint bias. We need to be very considerate about structural change, about institutional change, so on and so forth. So utilitarianism is the correct moral theory. I will go to bat for that, but a lot of our critics have a point, so fair enough.
Well, listeners, you heard it here first. So, Jeff, what are you working on next?
Well, I guess a few things. I have an upcoming book with Christopher Schlottman on food, animals, and the environment for Routledge, and then I'll be writing a book for Oxford University Press on animals and climate change, which will expand some of the things that we've talked about today. Then some papers and some nonprofit work. But then the other main thing is building and directing this new animal studies MA program at New York University, which will launch in fall 18 and is accepting applications now. So I encourage people to apply.
So, Jeff, we've got an international listenership. What month is fall?
Sorry. There goes my U.S.-centric bias.
So all the entire Northern Hemisphere's implicit in this problem?
Yes, we are. We are accepting applications through March 15th, 2018, and our first semester for the MA program will start in September 2018.
Wonderful. So look that up. So the next question was actually, how can people find out more about your work? So do you want to direct people to the website?
Sure. I work at New York University, so you can either find me by basically Googling my name, and then you can find my personal website at Jeff Sebo, JEFFSEBO.net, or you can find me on the NYU page.
Wonderful. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal study scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or you can follow me at SO_S. We have a Facebook page, and we love it when you leave reviews. Reviews at iTunes make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.